A little over a year and a half ago, I started coming out with videos ranting against the Boeing Corporation, against SLS, and against our current plans to go to the moon and the Artemis project, at least as far as SLS was concerned. And in that time, tens of thousands of people that I have never met have clicked on my videos over 10 million times. I am so grateful and also in a state of disbelief. But in that time, although my opinions about SLS have not changed, and I think that it is a deeply flawed and outdated way for the human race to return to the moon, I also feel that we're kind of stuck with it, especially since SpaceX was selected as the sole human landing services provider for Artemis. So the SLS and Orion are going to be transporting human beings to lunar orbit, and from there, they're going to be transferred to the Starship, a vessel that arguably could take care of the entire trip, but that's not what's going to be happening. SLS admittedly has made a lot more progress. Now, of course, they've had a lot more time and a lot more money to do this, but it really doesn't matter. SLS is on the verge of being ready to commence with their first orbital test of the moon, whereas Starship is going to be lucky to get to orbit this year, and in my opinion, they probably won't. So Artemis 1, and indeed several of the missions afterwards, may be stuck with SLS and Starship as strange bedfellows all the way to the time when human beings take their first steps on another world in over half a century. And you know what? At the moment, I'm okay with that, because Starship is being integrated into NASA's system. It's becoming part of what they believe will be our return to the moon, even though it's not the sole system that we'll be using. At least they're accepting this new bleeding edge technology as being viable and being possible, and that excites me a very great deal. But the question that a lot of us are asking is, how is this actually going to work? Is it even efficient in any kind of way? And how are we eventually going to change? Well, in this special episode celebrating 10 million views, I'm going to attempt to answer those questions. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. But there is trouble as well. Corrupt contractors who are looking to take advantage of one of the most underfunded departments of the U.S. government, and an unsustainable plan that is doomed to cancellation, as the Apollo project was. Something has to change. So it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry. So some of this plan is based off of speculation on my part, so bear with me here. There are, of course, no solid printed plans as to how all of this is going to be done with Starship plus SLS, but all of this makes sense to me. First of all, the launch platforms, the converted oil platforms that SpaceX is going to have to use, these things are going to need to be functional, because you're going to need a very rapid cadence of launches of Starship in order to be able to carry out the necessary on-orbit refueling swiftly enough in order to be able to fuel up lunar Starship for a particular mission. If you're waiting for launch pad availability, scrubbing because of no-go zones, that kind of thing, it's really going to create a lot of problems. So in my opinion, the launch platforms out at sea are going to be necessary in order for Starship to be used in conjunction with SLS to go to the moon. Now, the GAO claims that it's going to require a minimum of 14 launches if you include lunar Starship in order to do the necessary orbital refueling for Starship to be able to travel to lunar orbit, dock with the gateway, pick up the astronauts, go to the lunar surface, take off from the lunar surface, dock again with the gateway, and then return to LEO for refueling for another mission. So I don't know if it's really going to take that many, but I would say at least 10 or 11 launches. So that's why you're going to need this kind of cadence. And they're all, in my opinion, going to refuel one Starship, which will serve as a fuel depot. And once it's completely fueled up, it's going to transfer its fuel to lunar Starship. Why not just use lunar Starship as the depot? Because it also has life support that's going to be sucked away if it stays in orbit for too long. Life support is not going to endure forever, so you're going to need to use lunar Starship as little as possible during the refueling process until it's actually ready to make the journey. I think that's going to be a very important factor. So this is a very important consideration. You're going to need either a lot of tankers, or the reusability factor of Starship is going to have to be pretty much perfected at this point if you're going to carry out this many refueling missions in a relatively short span of time. And if the refueling process takes too long, then propellant boil-off in orbit is going to suck away your fuel as fast as you're putting it into the ship. So all of this pretty much needs to be carried out as rapidly as possible, and all of it needs to be completed before you even think about launching SLS. Once lunar Starship is ready, then and only then can you get ready to launch SLS to lunar orbit. All of this is actually pretty complicated. We're looking, if you include SLS, at like 12 to 14 launches, if not more, in order to make one journey to the lunar surface. Logistically, this is going to be somewhat difficult. However, from a cost standpoint, if Starship is completely reusable, which is the goal after all, it's going to be a hell of a lot less expensive than doing it any other way. So, launch 100 tons into the fuel depot, land, get ready to take off, launch 100 tons into the fuel depot, etc., until it's ready for Artemis 3 is where it's going to require the first usage. So 2024, 2025 at the earliest is how long SpaceX has to get this cadence down good enough to where they will be able to carry out that much on-orbit refueling in order to get Starship, or rather lunar Starship, all the way to the lunar gateway. So that is a big barrier to jump over in order to get this to work, but once again, we always knew about that. NASA always knew about that, and that's just what they're going to have to deal with in order to get this functional. So, enough of that. So once lunar Starship is ready to go in low Earth orbit, then and only then can SLS take off. I'm sure they can have done a lot of prep work prior to this, but then it will be ready to go. Now, SLS should be a pretty polished product by now, because it will have carried out Artemis 1, which is going to be going either this year or the beginning of next year, and Artemis 2, which will be the first crewed mission, which will not require lunar Starship. That will will simply require SLS and Orion to go all the way to the lunar gateway and then Orion to return with a crew on board, but none of that will require a landing on the lunar surface. Therefore, lunar Starship will not be necessary. And that's another positive aspect to this. If for some reason during Artemis 3 lunar Starship doesn't work out, if it fails or has some other issues, the astronauts on Lunar Gateway can just return on the Orion without any problems. They won't require lunar Starship. They won't be able to land on the moon either, but at least they'll be safe. And that is a positive aspect to this partnership. So NASA and Boeing will have Artemis 1 and 2 to get SLS down pat, and let's hope that everything goes well with that. If it doesn't, then this whole thing is going to be put on hold for quite some time. But they will have a substantial amount of time to perfect this design until Artemis 3 rolls around. Until that time, SpaceX will also have to be perfecting Starship, especially the whole on-orbit refueling thing. As I've said a number of times, that is probably going to be their biggest challenge to the whole reusability model, to the idea of on-orbit refueling, especially swiftly, the whole concept of rapid reusability that Elon talks about all the time, and he's absolutely right. It's not going to work without rapid reusability, whereas SLS can just travel all the way to the moon without any refueling. A lot simpler, a lot more old-fashioned, and a hell of a lot more expensive. Now, you may have noticed that abort tower fly away at that point. Another advantage that SLS has is the ability to abort a mission and save the crew pretty late in the launch process, something that Starship cannot do. And it's going to be some time, I think, before NASA is comfortable enough with Starship in order to send people up on it without this kind of abort capability. It is an old-fashioned way of doing things, but it has a tried and true history of keeping crews safe, and that's going to be something that I think NASA will cling to for some time. So Orion, pushed by the ICPS, will make its way towards lunar orbit. Now, for Artemis 3, it may dock with the Gateway, it may not if the Gateway is not ready. And by the way, we also need to talk about how the Gateway is going to be deployed as well. Now, I've talked about the Gateway quite a number of times on this channel, but I think it's important to note how many changes it's gone through and how much NASA has embraced SpaceX. This is the power and propulsion element that is going to, of course, provide the power and the ability for the Gateway to change locations in its orbit, and then the Halo, the habitation unit. These are going to be the first two components that will probably be in place at the time of Artemis 3, or at least hopefully. Now, as most of you probably know, NASA has wisely decided to deploy these elements with a Falcon Heavy rather than SLS, which is going to save hundreds of millions of dollars. And later on, a logistics module will be added, another habitation unit that will be built by the European Space Agency, an airlock module by Roscosmos, theoretically, assuming they stay involved in this, and the Esprit module, also built by the European Space Agency. And as you can see, the idea was to use SLS over and over again for this, and instead it's going to be Falcon Heavy, which is going to make a huge difference. And on top of that, as you probably know, Falcon Heavy will also be used to resupply this station. And this will be the staging area that the astronauts use to visit the lunar surface, or to also carry them to different orbital configurations so they can land on different parts of the moon. The Gateway provides an enormous amount of flexibility for the astronauts and also a safe place for them to live, assuming that anything goes wrong. So if we have issues with lunar Starship or any other part of the plan overall for Artemis, the Gateway will at least keep the astronauts alive for a while until a solution can be discovered. So here's the process. SLS and Orion are dispatched to lunar orbit to dock with the gateway, and perhaps some small sats will also be deployed as they're going to be in Artemis 1 to make the trip a little bit more worthwhile and to also provide a little bit more logistical support for Artemis. So Orion docks with the gateway or simply orbits the moon until it eventually rendezvous with Lunar Starship, which will be dispatched at roughly the same time. So Lunar Starship makes its way towards cislunar space, docks also with the gateway, presumably at another airlock because Orion is going to be occupying one of the airlocks. And then Lunar Starship picks up the astronauts and transports them to the lunar surface, and then subsequently returns to the gateway or to cislunar space if there is no gateway, and rendezvous with Orion again. And this process gets repeated over and over again as the missions proceed, depending of course on whether or not NASA feels that Lunar Starship is the best solution. This is where Appendix N comes in, because in my opinion, it's likely that NASA is going to pick a different lander for the sustainable lander program, and then see whether or not Lunar Starship or this other lander, which I hope is Alpaca, but we'll see, is the most practical lander to use for long-term missions to the lunar surface. Obviously, Lunar Starship is the least expensive option, but logistically it's going to be a lot more difficult because of all of the refueling launches. But that aside, Artemis 4 will take place in March of 2026 with a duration of about 30 days, which is the same as Artemis 3. Then Artemis 5 will be using the SLS Block 1B as Artemis 4 will, so an improved version of SLS that essentially just uses the exploration upper stage instead of the ICPS. Then Artemis 6 the following year in 2027, also 30 days, and then Artemis 7, which will be 60 days. At this point, there will need to be some kind of habitation on the surface of the moon in order to house the astronauts. Perhaps they'll just use Starship as the base, or perhaps they'll build something else. And this ESA concept was designed by an architectural firm called La Biennale, and I probably am mispronouncing that, but it's a pretty ambitious idea for a lunar base, and I have to admit, I like it. And the only way that something like this could possibly be built on the lunar surface is if you have a cargo vessel with 100 tons worth of payload, obviously Starship. So regardless of whether or not they decide to use Lunar Starship as the sustainable lander for human beings, using Starship for cargo is going to be an absolute essential for long-term habitation, and that is going to get longer as time goes on. Artemis 8 and Artemis 9 are both going to be 30 days in duration, but by the time Artemis 10 comes around, we're looking at 180 days on the moon, and that's going to require some kind of long-term habitation setup. It's very ambitious, and we're looking at doing this by 2030, only less than a decade away. I mean, that is crazy exciting. Is it possible? Well, maybe, if we use Starship and its enormous cargo capacity. Now, there are, of course, some politicians who are interested in jobs in their state who are advocating using upgraded versions of SLS that can carry over 100 tons worth of cargo all the way to the moon. Yes, actually a greater cargo capacity than Starship, but at the same time, they're going to cost $1 to $2 billion minimum per launch, and that's just not sustainable, not with everything else they're going to have to be doing, building bases on the moon, maintaining the gateway, etc. So Lunar Starship then transfers the astronauts back to the Orion. The Orion makes its way back to Earth and re-enters. So this is how this whole process works, using two massive rockets to deliver one crew to the moon. And by the way, also using a lot more massive rockets for refueling purposes. And ironically, Lunar Starship will also have to return to the Earth to be refueled hold in low Earth orbit. And of course, the part that really pisses me off is the fact that the Orion, is the only thing that's going to get reused. Every part of SLS, including its legendary reusable engines from the shuttle days, are going to be wasted. So clearly, the obvious solution to all of this, and the better way to take care of this problem, is to use Lunar Starship the whole way, or just use regular old Starship the whole way, with life support, which it's going to need for Lunar Starship anyway, and just deliver the astronauts to the moon in this manner, perhaps transferring them briefly to the gateway and then transferring them back to the Starship when it's time to set down on the moon. Why do you need an entirely new launch system or entirely different launch system rather, in order to make the whole process work? It makes absolutely no sense, except for one thing. NASA doesn't trust Starship yet, at least not with the entire process of taking off and re-entering with human beings on board, and they're unlikely to be comfortable with this concept for quite some time, mostly because Starship is an unproven concept, whereas Orion has already been tested in orbit and already successfully re-entered without any problems. This was done years ago, so Orion is an already proven and safe system, and by the way, reusable as well, to get astronauts to the moon and to get them back to Earth safely, whereas Starship is a unknown quantity in a big way, and it's going to be some time before NASA considers it to be anything else. And yet, they're going to trust it as far as taking astronauts off the gateway, landing them on the moon, and returning them to the gateway safely. I mean, that's a pretty big leap of faith right there. So why not take the additional leap of faith in terms of launching the astronauts on this system in the first place and having it handle the entire process? A big question, and one that's unlikely to be answered for some time. So for now, it appears that this is the problem that we are stuck with, or rather the process that we're stuck with. SLS, with all of the hype surrounding it right now, and the progress that it's made, admittedly. I mean, this has gotten a lot further this year than I thought it was going to. It has a realistic chance of making it to the moon in November of 2021. I never thought that SLS would be able to do this, but it's almost completely stacked. Almost everything has been fully tested, and launching in a couple of months seems very, very possible. But as far as long-term solutions are concerned, this simply will not be sustainable. $1 to $2 billion per launch is going to eat away at NASA's funding. There's going to be questions asked in Congress as to why we're doing this, why we're spending so much money to go someplace where we've already explored, at least in the mind of some of these simpletons. So what are we going to do in the long run? Well, if we stick with SLS plus Starship, we are heading towards disaster and cancellation. I'm convinced of it. There's no way Congress is going to keep supporting this. So we need to transition away from expendable. We need to transition away from SLS. It doesn't matter how safe it may be in the long run, it's not going to be cost effective in the long run. And there needs to be another solution to deliver crews safely to the lunar surface. And at least part of this solution is going to have to be Starship if Artemis is going to survive in the long run. But how the hell can this be done? How can a ship this unproven, this bleeding edge, and also something that doesn't have a safe abort system, how are you going to convince NASA to go back to something that is kind of similar to the shuttle, at least in terms of a lack of an abort system? How is that going to be accomplished? Well, in part 2 of this 10 million view special episode, I'm going to explain one plan that would allow Starship to be used to carry crews all the way to the moon without taking these kinds of risks. It would involve also the use of other commercial partners and would also use a lot less orbital refueling, or at least a significant reduction of this, which in my opinion is one of the weak points. So stay tuned, we got a new episode coming up, and in the meantime, stay angry about space!